The sterile white walls of the oncology center felt colder than usual that morning as I sat in the waiting room, clutching my appointment card with trembling fingers. The clock on the wall read 8:47 a.m., and my chemotherapy session was scheduled for 9 Gaobai. I kept glancing toward the entrance, hoping to see familiar faces walking through those automatic doors. But the only people entering were strangers carrying their own burdens of illness and hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My daughter Emily had promised she'd be here. Of course I'll drive you, Mom, she'd said just 3 days earlier, her voice warm with reassurance over the phone. This is important. We'll all be there to support you. My son Michael had echoed the same sentiment, and even my sister Patricia had committed to making the drive from across town. Yet here I was, completely alone, watching other patients being comforted by their loved ones while I faced the most frightening medical journey of my life in solitude. The nurse called my name, and I stood on unsteady legs, my purse feeling heavier than it should have as I followed her down the familiar hallway toward the treatment room. "Is someone coming to pick you up afterward?" she asked kindly, glancing at the empty chair beside me where my family should have been sitting. I forced a smile and lied, saying they'd be here soon, even though my phone showed no missed calls. No apologetic text messages, no explanation for their absence. As the IV needle slipped into my arm and the chemotherapy drugs began flowing into my bloodstream, I closed my eyes and felt something shift inside me. Not just the familiar nausea that would follow in a few hours, but something deeper. A quiet realization that perhaps I had been fooling myself about the people I thought I could count on. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever suspected, was that while they saw me as just Barbara Lewis, the retired elementary school teacher who needed their help and sympathy, I had been building something extraordinary in the shadows of my quiet life. My name is Barbara Lewis, though most people have always called me Barb, and for 63 years I lived what everyone around me considered a perfectly ordinary life. I taught 3rd grade at Maplewood Elementary for 37 years, married my college sweetheart Robert when I was 24, and raised 2 children in a modest ranch house on Elm Street, in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least they thought they did. Robert and I had what appeared to be a traditional marriage. He worked as a mechanical engineer at the local manufacturing plant, bringing home a steady paycheck that covered our mortgage, car payments, and family vacations to the same lake house we rented every summer for 2 decades. I handled the household, finances, clipped coupons, planned meals around grocery store sales, and saved every penny I could squeeze from our modest dual income. To our friends and neighbors, we were the picture of middle-class stability, living within our means and never asking for more than life had given us. What Robert never knew, what our children Emily and Michael never suspected, and what I never shared with anyone, was that I had inherited a small sum of money from my grandmother when I was 28 years old. It wasn't a fortune by any stretch of the imagination, just $15,000 that my grandmother had saved throughout her entire life, stashing away quarters and dollar bills in coffee cans and old jewelry boxes. She left it to me with a handwritten note that simply said, "For the smart girl who always asked the right questions." Instead of spending that money on a family vacation or home improvements like Robert suggested, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life, though no one would realize it for decades. I invested every penny of that inheritance in a small startup company that was developing educational software for schools. The year was 1987, and personal computers were just beginning to find their way into classrooms across America. Most people thought it was a risky investment, too uncertain, too new. But as a teacher, I could see the writing on the wall. Technology was going to transform education, and I wanted to be part of that transformation. The company struggled for the first few years, and there were moments when I thought I had made a terrible mistake with my grandmother's money. Robert would occasionally ask about the inheritance, and I would simply tell him I had invested it conservatively, and that it was doing fine. He never pressed for details, trusting that his practical wife was being sensible with money as she always had been. Meanwhile, I spent my evenings after grading papers reading everything I could find about technology stocks, market trends, and emerging companies. I subscribed to financial magazines under my maiden name and had them delivered to the school so Robert wouldn't see them arriving at our house. By 1995, the educational software company had been acquired by a larger corporation, and my initial $15,000 investment had grown to nearly $200,000. I was stunned, thrilled, and terrified all at once. This was more money than Robert and I made combined in 3 years, and I had earned it through careful research and what turned out to be exceptional timing. But instead of celebrating or sharing the news with my family, I made another decision that would set the pattern for the next 30 years of my secret financial life. I reinvested the money, diversifying into technology stocks that I had been quietly researching. Apple was still recovering from near bankruptcy. Microsoft was becoming a household name, and dozens of smaller companies were creating the foundation for what would become the Internet revolution. I opened investment accounts under my name only, using my school address for all correspondence, and began building a portfolio that grew steadily year after year, while my family continued to see me as the frugal teacher who worried about spending too much on groceries. The routine became second nature to me. During my lunch breaks at school, I would call my broker to check on my investments or research new opportunities. I used my classroom computer to monitor stock prices and read financial news websites that my colleagues assumed were educational resources. When I attended conferences for teachers, I would often extend my stay by a day or two and attend investment seminars instead, telling Robert I was taking additional professional development courses. He was proud of my dedication to education and never questioned why I seemed so enthusiastic about learning new teaching methods. Our children grew up completely unaware that their mother had become what financial advisors would call a sophisticated investor. Emily, our oldest, was focused on her studies and later her career in marketing. Michael showed more interest in sports and eventually became a high school football coach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Both children saw their parents as hardworking people who lived modestly and saved carefully for retirement. They had no reason to suspect that while their father was putting away small amounts in his company's 401k plan, their mother was building a portfolio worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and eventually millions. Robert's sudden heart attack when he was 59 came without warning. One moment he was watching television after dinner, and the next moment he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, but it was complicated by the secret I had been carrying for over 2 decades. As we planned his funeral and sorted through his affairs, I realized that my carefully hidden financial life would have to remain hidden even longer. Robert had left behind a modest life insurance policy and his retirement savings, which totaled about $80,000. Our children and extended family rallied around me, worried about how a retired teacher would manage financially as a widow. They insisted on helping me understand our finances, going through bank statements and bills with the assumption that Robert had handled all the important monetary decisions. I let them believe it, nodding gratefully as Emily explained how to balance a checkbook, and Michael offered to help me create a budget for living on Social Security and Robert's small pension. All the while, my investment accounts continued to grow, compounding returns on decades of careful stock selection and reinvestment. By the time I was 55 and officially widowed, my hidden portfolio was worth more than $3 million. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family saw me as vulnerable and financially dependent, just as I was becoming truly wealthy. But there was something comforting about their perception, something that allowed me to continue living the simple life I had always enjoyed, while knowing I had the security and freedom that comes with financial independence. I continued teaching for another 8 years after Robert's death, not because I needed the income, but because I genuinely loved working with children and my colleagues had no idea that the modest teacher in room 14 could have retired decades earlier. During those years as a widow, my investment strategy became even more sophisticated. I had learned to read market trends, understand economic cycles, and identify emerging opportunities before they became obvious to mainstream investors. I invested early in companies that would later become household names, rode the dot-com boom carefully by taking profits before the crash, and positioned myself perfectly for the recovery that followed. My financial advisor, whom I met with quarterly, at his office 2 towns away, often told me I had one of the most impressive portfolios he had ever managed for someone who wasn't a professional investor. When I finally retired from teaching at 63, my family threw me a small party at Emily's house. They spoke lovingly about my decades of dedication to education and worried openly about how I would adjust to living on a fixed income. Emily had already started researching senior discounts and community programs for retirees, while Michael suggested I might want to consider moving to a smaller apartment to reduce my expenses. I smiled and thanked them for their concern, all while knowing that my investment portfolio had grown to over $8 million and was generating more passive income each month than my teaching salary had ever provided. The cancer diagnosis came 6 months after my retirement party. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive but treatable according to Dr. Morrison, my oncologist. The news hit our family like a devastating storm. Emily immediately took charge of my medical care, insisting on attending every doctor's appointment and taking detailed notes about treatment options. Michael researched cancer centers and second opinions, determined to make sure his mother received the best possible care. My sister Patricia offered to help with whatever I needed, from grocery shopping to housework during treatment. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely grateful for their involvement in my life. Fighting cancer was terrifying, and having family support seemed essential for getting through the months of chemotherapy and recovery ahead. They created schedules for driving me to appointments, organized meal deliveries for days when I would be too sick to cook, and promised to be there for every step of the journey. I was touched by their dedication and felt guilty about the financial secret I had kept from them for so long. As I prepared for my first chemotherapy session, I almost considered telling them the truth about my financial situation. Perhaps it would bring us closer together, I thought. Maybe they would be proud of what I had accomplished through careful investing and financial planning. But something held me back, some instinct that the dynamic between us would change in ways I wasn't prepared for if they knew I was wealthy. For now, I decided it was enough that they were willing to support me through cancer treatment. The money could remain my secret a little longer. Looking back, I realized that was the last time I truly trusted that my family loved me unconditionally. The last time I believed that their concern for my welfare was purely about my health and happiness, rather than about what they thought I could or couldn't handle on my own. The last time I saw them as the caring, devoted children and sister I had raised and loved without question. Because what happened next, starting with that first abandoned chemotherapy appointment, would reveal truths about the people closest to me that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and unconditional love. The morning of my first treatment, I woke up early and dressed carefully in comfortable clothes as the nurse had recommended. I ate a light breakfast and took the anti-nausea medication Dr. Morrison had prescribed as a preventive measure. My appointment was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and Emily had promised to pick me up at 8:30. I waited by the front window, watching for her car to pull into my driveway, my overnight bag packed with books, snacks, and entertainment. For what I had been told would be a 4-hour treatment session, 8:30 came and went, then 8:45. By 9 o'clock, I was starting to worry that something had happened to Emily, or that she had gotten the date confused. I called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Michael next, thinking perhaps they had arranged for him to drive me instead, but his phone also went to voicemail. Growing anxious about missing my appointment, I called a taxi and arrived at the cancer center 15 minutes late, apologizing profusely to the receptionist and explaining that my ride had fallen through. that was the beginning of what would become a pattern over the next several months. Promises made and broken, schedules created and abandoned, support offered and then withdrawn without explanation or apology. It started small, with missed rides and forgotten meal deliveries, but gradually escalated into something that felt like deliberate abandonment just when I needed them most. And through it all, they had no idea that the woman they were treating with such casual neglect had the financial resources to hire private nurses, personal drivers, and any level of care she desired. What they also didn't know was that their mother, the woman they saw as a helpless retiree struggling with cancer, had been using her quiet time during treatment sessions to make some of the most profitable investment decisions of her life. While poison dripped into my veins through an IV tube, I was researching biotech companies developing new cancer treatments, identifying pharmaceutical stocks poised for breakthrough announcements, and positioning my portfolio for growth that would soon make their inheritance discussions irrelevant in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The stage was set for revelations that would change everything, though none of us knew it yet. I was about to learn who my family really was when they thought I was at my most vulnerable, and they were about to discover who I had become during all those quiet years when they assumed I was just their ordinary, predictable mother and sister. The woman sitting alone in that chemotherapy chair, watching other families support their loved ones while mine was nowhere to be found, was not the person any of them thought they knew. But that discovery was still weeks away. For now, I had treatment to endure, a portfolio to manage, and a growing understanding that the people I had trusted most in the world might not be worthy of that trust after all. What I didn't yet realize was that their abandonment during my cancer treatment would become the catalyst for revealing a strength and independence I had spent decades building in secret, and that their assumptions about my vulnerability would prove to be the biggest miscalculation they had ever made. The second chemotherapy session was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the first one where I had sat alone despite all the promises of family support. This time, I decided to test whether their absence had been a genuine emergency, or something more troubling. I called Emily 3 days in advance to confirm she would be driving me, and she assured me enthusiastically that she wouldn't miss it. Michael sent me a text message the night before, saying he had rearranged his coaching schedule specifically to be there with me during treatment. I should have known better than to hope. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything feel more difficult than it should. I prepared myself the same way as before, taking my anti-nausea medication, eating a light breakfast, and dressing in layers since the treatment center was always cold. By 8:15, I was ready and waiting by the window for Emily's silver Honda to appear in my driveway. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one adding weight to the growing pit in my stomach that had nothing to do with cancer, and everything to do with the sinking realization that I was going to be abandoned again. At 8:45, 15 minutes, before my appointment time, I called Emily. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her cheerful recorded voice told me to leave a message and she'd get back to me as soon as possible. I left a brief message asking if she was on her way, trying to keep the hurt and frustration out of my voice. Then I called Michael with the same result. Voicemail. This time, I didn't wait until the last minute to arrange alternative transportation. I had already looked up the number for a medical transport service that specialized in cancer patients, and I called them with enough time to arrive punctually for my appointment. The driver was a kind woman named Rose who had been doing this work for over a decade. During the 20-minute drive to the cancer center, she told me about other patients she had driven who were going through treatment alone. "You'd be surprised how common it is," she said gently, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Families mean well, but they often don't understand how important consistency is during treatment. They think missing one appointment won't matter, or they assume someone else will step in." Rose's words stung because they rang so true. I thanked her for the ride and scheduled her to pick me up after my 4-hour treatment session. As I walked into the cancer center for the second time in 2 weeks, I noticed other patients being accompanied by attentive family members, just as I had during my first visit. The contrast between their experience and mine was becoming impossible to ignore. The oncology nurses were kind and professional, but I could see the concern in their eyes when they realized I was alone again. During previous visits, they had asked about my support system, emphasizing how important it was to have help during the difficult weeks ahead. I had confidently told them about my children and sister, describing the elaborate care schedule they had created for me. Now I felt embarrassed by those conversations, wondering if the nurses could see through my attempts to project the image of a supported patient. Dr. Morrison stopped by during my treatment to check on my progress and ask about side effects from the first session. I had experienced the expected fatigue and nausea, but nothing unmanageable. What I didn't tell him was that the emotional impact of my family's absence had been far worse than any physical symptoms. He asked about my support system, and I found myself giving vague, positive responses while the chemotherapy drugs dripped slowly into my bloodstream. "It's important that you don't try to handle this alone," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many patients struggle without adequate help. "Cancer treatment affects the whole family, and healing happens faster when patients feel supported and cared for." I nodded and smiled, assuring him that I was well taken care of, even as I sat completely alone in that treatment chair, with no idea whether anyone in my family even remembered where I was. Supposed to be that morning, after Dr. Morrison left, I settled in for the long treatment session with a book and my phone. But instead of reading, I found myself checking my investment accounts and researching new opportunities, as had become my habit during the quiet hours of chemotherapy. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family saw me as a burden requiring their care and attention, I was actively managing a portfolio worth millions of dollars and making financial decisions that would have impressed professional money managers. That morning, I had been following a small biotech company that was developing a revolutionary cancer treatment. Their stock had been undervalued for months, but I had been reading their research publications and following their clinical trial results. Everything pointed to a major breakthrough announcement within the next few weeks. Using my phone, I purchased 10,000 shares while sitting in that treatment chair, a decision that would prove to be one of the most profitable trades of my investing career. The juxtaposition was striking. My family believed I needed their help to manage basic daily tasks, yet I was confidently investing amounts of money that exceeded their annual salaries. They saw me as vulnerable and dependent, while I was actively growing wealth that could secure not just my own future, but theirs as well, if I chose to share it. The disconnect between their perception and reality was becoming more apparent with each passing day. When Rose picked me up after treatment, she asked how I was feeling and whether my family would be helping me at home that evening. I told her I would be fine on my own, which was true, though not for the reasons she probably assumed. That night, as I dealt with the familiar waves of nausea and fatigue, I also monitored after-hours trading and planned my investment strategy for the following week. The side effects of chemotherapy were manageable with the right medications and rest. The side effects of family abandonment were proving to be much more complicated. The pattern continued through my third and fourth treatments. Each time, Emily or Michael would confirm they would be there, and each time I would find myself making alternative arrangements when they failed to show up. Their excuses, when they bothered to provide them, became increasingly weak and transparent. Emily claimed she had forgotten about an important work presentation. Michael said his team had an unexpected practice that he couldn't miss. My sister Patricia simply stopped responding to my calls altogether. By the fifth treatment, I had stopped asking for their help entirely. I had Rose's medical transport service on speed dial, and I had learned to prepare for the physical and emotional challenges of treatment sessions on my own. What surprised me was how liberating it felt to stop depending on people who had proven themselves unreliable. For the first time in months, I wasn't disappointed when Thursday mornings arrived, because I no longer had expectations that could be shattered. During these weeks of learning to navigate cancer treatment independently, something interesting began happening with my investment portfolio. The biotech stock I had purchased during my second treatment session announced positive clinical trial results, and the stock price tripled overnight. My early investment in a pharmaceutical company developing immunotherapy treatments paid off when they received FDA approval ahead of schedule. The technology stocks I had been holding for years continued their steady climb as artificial intelligence and biotechnology sectors experienced unprecedented growth. While my family assumed I was struggling financially and would need their help, managing my modest retirement savings, my net worth was approaching $10 million. The monthly dividend income from my portfolio exceeded what most people earned in annual salaries. I could have afforded to hire a private medical team, travel to any cancer treatment center in the world, or fund experimental treatments that weren't covered by insurance. Instead, I continued living in my modest house, driving my 10-year-old car and maintaining the image of a frugal retiree that my family expected to see. The decision to keep my wealth secret wasn't about deception exactly. It was more about self-protection. I had seen how money changed family dynamics, how knowledge of inheritance could alter relationships and motivations. Part of me wondered if my children's growing absence from my life was related to assumptions they had made about my financial situation. Perhaps they believed there was nothing significant to inherit, and therefore less reason to invest time and energy in maintaining a close relationship with their sick mother. That thought, when it first occurred to me during my 6th treatment session, was more painful than any physical side effect I had experienced. The possibility that their love and concern was conditional on what they believed I could provide. For them financially was almost too devastating to consider. But as weeks passed and their absence became more pronounced, I found myself unable to dismiss the idea entirely. The 7th treatment brought an unexpected revelation. As I sat in my usual chair, managing my investment accounts on my phone, between conversations with nurses, I overheard a phone conversation taking place in the chair next to mine. The patient, a woman about my age, was speaking with her daughter about financial concerns related to her treatment. She was worried about the cost of medications, the impact of missed work on her family's budget, and whether they would be able to afford the additional treatments her doctor had recommended. Listening to her conversation made me realize how completely different my situation was from most cancer patients. Money wasn't a concern for me at all. I could afford any treatment, any medication, any level of care without touching my principal investment. Yet my family had abandoned me just as thoroughly as if I were the most burdensome charity case imaginable. Their absence wasn't about financial stress or practical limitations. It was about something else entirely, something that felt much more personal and hurtful. That evening, after my 7th treatment, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my relationship with my family forever. I called Emily and asked her to meet me for lunch the following weekend. To my surprise, she agreed immediately, sounding almost eager to spend time together. We arranged to meet at a small restaurant downtown, the kind of place where we had shared many conversations over the years. Emily arrived 10 minutes late, which had become typical for her interactions with me lately. She looked polished and professional in her marketing executive attire, checking her phone frequently and giving the impression that this lunch was fitting uncomfortably into her busy schedule. We ordered our food and made small talk about her work and my treatment progress. Everything felt forced and superficial, lacking the warmth and intimacy that had characterized our relationship throughout her childhood and young adulthood. Halfway through our meal, I decided to test a theory that had been forming in my mind over the past several weeks. I mentioned, casually, that I had been looking into my financial situation and was concerned about whether my savings would last through my treatment and recovery. I explained that the medical bills were higher than I had expected, and that I was worried about becoming a burden on the family if my money ran out. Emily's reaction was immediate and telling. Her demeanor shifted from distracted politeness to focused attention. She put down her phone and leaned forward, suddenly very interested in the details of my financial concerns. She asked specific questions about my savings, my monthly expenses, and my insurance coverage. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely engaged in our conversation, though clearly not for the reasons I had hoped. "Mom, you know Michael and I will help however we can," she said, though her tone suggested she was calculating costs rather than offering unconditional support. "But it would be good to know exactly what we're looking at so we can plan accordingly." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Emily becoming increasingly focused on the practical aspects of my supposed financial difficulties. She offered to help me create a budget, suggested ways to reduce my expenses, and even mentioned that she had been researching government assistance programs for cancer patients. Her concern seemed genuine, but it was clearly motivated by the belief that my financial needs would directly impact her own resources and lifestyle. When we parted ways in the restaurant parking lot, Emily hugged me with more warmth than she had shown in weeks. She promised to call me that evening to discuss how the family could help with my financial situation, and she seemed more engaged and attentive than she had been since my diagnosis. The contrast between her behavior when she thought I was financially secure and her reaction to my supposed money problems was stark and deeply revealing. That evening, Emily called as promised, and we had a lengthy conversation about my fabricated financial concerns. She had already spoken with Michael, and they had begun developing a plan to provide monthly financial assistance to help cover my treatment costs. They were willing to sacrifice some of their own discretionary spending to support me, though it was clear that this sacrifice would require significant adjustments to their lifestyles. Over the following days, both Emily and Michael became much more attentive and involved in my care. They called regularly to check on my health and my financial situation. They offered to accompany me to my next treatment session, something they hadn't done since the very first appointment. Michael even suggested that I might want to move in with his family temporarily to reduce my housing expenses during treatment. Their renewed attention confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Their concern for my welfare was directly related to their perception of my financial vulnerability. When they thought I was independently managing my situation without needing their help, they felt free to focus on their own lives and priorities. But when they believed I might become financially dependent on them, their engagement increased dramatically. The realization was both heartbreaking and illuminating. I had spent decades providing for my family, supporting them through college, helping with down payments on their first homes, and giving generous gifts at every holiday and milestone. But their care for me was conditional on their belief that I needed their financial assistance. They weren't neglecting a wealthy mother who could take care of herself. They were potentially abandoning a struggling retiree who might become a burden. For several days, I considered whether to continue the deception or reveal the truth about my financial situation. Part of me wanted to test how far their renewed attention would extend, while another part was disgusted by the entire situation. I had learned something about my children that I wished I hadn't discovered, and I wasn't sure how to move forward with that knowledge. The decision was made for me during my 8th treatment session. Emily had volunteered to drive me, keeping her promise to be more involved now that she believed I needed financial help. During the 4-hour treatment, she spent most of her time on her phone handling work calls and responding to emails. When she wasn't working, she talked about her own financial stresses, including her mortgage payment, her children's college funds, and her concerns about how helping me would impact her family's budget. At one point, while discussing her financial calculations, Emily mentioned that she had been thinking about my house and whether I should consider selling it to help fund my treatment. She had done some research on real estate values in my neighborhood and believed I could get a good price that would provide a significant cushion for my medical expenses. "It's probably too big for you anyway, Mom," she said, not looking up from her phone. "And the maintenance costs must be getting expensive. You could find a nice little apartment somewhere closer to Michael and me, and the money from the house sale would take care of all your medical bills with plenty left over." I sat quietly in that treatment chair, watching my daughter plan the dismantling of my life based on her assumption that I was financially desperate. She was discussing the sale of the home where she and Michael had grown up, where her father and I had built our life together, where I had planned to live out my remaining years. To her, it was simply an asset that could be liquidated to solve a problem she believed I couldn't handle on my own. The conversation continued with Emily outlining various cost-cutting measures I could implement, from switching to generic medications to shopping at discount grocery stores. She had clearly put considerable thought into how to manage my supposed financial crisis, though she had put no similar effort into simply being present during my treatment sessions when she thought I didn't need her help. As the chemotherapy drugs continued their slow drip into my bloodstream, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done pretending to be the financially vulnerable woman my family expected to see. I was done accepting their conditional care and calculating concern. Most importantly, I was done hiding the truth about who I really was and what I had accomplished during the decades they had taken me for granted. But I wasn't going to reveal my wealth in anger or use it as a weapon against them. Instead, I was going to use this knowledge about their true motivations to design a test that would show me exactly who my family members really were when they thought no one was watching. And depending on the results of that test, I would decide whether they deserved to know the truth about the fortune I had been building while they saw me as nothing more than an ordinary retired teacher. The plan that began forming in my mind during that 8th treatment session was elegant in its simplicity. I would give Emily, Michael, and Patricia exactly what they seemed to want: the opportunity to demonstrate their love and loyalty to a family member who truly needed their help. But I would also be watching carefully to see how they handled that responsibility when they thought it would cost them time, money, and convenience, with no prospect of future reward. What they didn't know was that their behavior during this test would determine not only our future relationship, but also whether they would ever learn about the millions of dollars that could transform their lives if they proved themselves worthy of that knowledge. They had shown me their true faces when they thought I was strong and independent. Now I was going to see who they really were when they believed I was weak and dependent. The test was about to begin, and none of them had any idea they were about to be evaluated. The plan I devised during my 8th chemotherapy session required careful orchestration and perfect timing. I needed to create a scenario that would reveal my family's true character while maintaining the fiction of my financial desperation. Most importantly, I had to do this while continuing my cancer treatment and managing an investment portfolio that was generating more wealth than any of them could imagine. The first step was to deepen their belief in my supposed financial crisis. Over the next 2 weeks, I began making carefully calculated comments about money during our phone conversations. I mentioned that my insurance company had denied coverage for a newer, more expensive anti-nausea medication. I expressed concern about the copays for my treatments adding up faster than expected. I even suggested that I might need to consider less frequent follow-up appointments to save money, a statement that prompted immediate alarm from both Emily and Michael. Their responses were exactly what I had anticipated. Emily immediately offered to research patient assistance programs and generic alternatives to my medications. Michael suggested that I apply for disability benefits to supplement my income. Both of them became increasingly involved in the practical aspects of my treatment, though their involvement was clearly motivated by financial calculations rather than emotional support. During this period, my actual financial situation was experiencing unprecedented growth. The biotech stocks I had purchased during my early treatment sessions were performing beyond my most optimistic projections. 3 separate companies in my portfolio announced breakthrough clinical trial results within the same month, causing their stock prices to surge. My pharmaceutical investments were benefiting from increased focus on cancer research and immunotherapy development. Even my conservative technology holdings were climbing steadily as artificial intelligence applications expanded into healthcare. By my 10th treatment session, my portfolio had crossed the $12 million threshold. The irony of sitting in a cancer treatment center while managing such extraordinary wealth was not lost on me. I was using my phone to execute trades worth hundreds of thousands of dollars while my family believed I was struggling to afford basic medical care. The contradiction between perception and reality had become almost surreal. Emily accompanied me to that 10th session, having insisted that she wanted to understand exactly what my treatment involved so she could better help me manage the associated costs. She brought a notebook and pen, taking detailed notes about the medications being administered, the length of the session, and the medical terminology the nurses used. Her dedication to documenting every aspect of my care was impressive, though I knew her motivation was primarily financial rather than medical. During the 4-hour treatment, Emily made several phone calls to insurance companies and billing departments, advocating aggressively for coverage of my treatments and medications. She spoke with the authority of someone protecting a significant financial investment, which, in her mind, she was. Her willingness to spend hours navigating medical bureaucracy on my behalf was touching, even though I knew it stemmed from her desire to minimize the family's financial burden rather than genuine concern for my well-being. While Emily worked diligently on my supposed financial problems, I quietly managed my actual financial empire. I sold positions in companies that had reached my target prices, reallocated funds into emerging market opportunities, and researched new investments in companies developing cancer treatments that I was learning about firsthand through my own medical experience. The expertise I was gaining as a cancer patient was actually improving my investment strategy in the healthcare sector. That afternoon, as Emily drove me home from treatment, she outlined a comprehensive plan she had developed for managing my financial crisis. She had researched every available assistance program, identified potential cost savings in my monthly budget, and even calculated how much she and Michael could contribute monthly to help cover my expenses. Her thoroughness was remarkable, and her willingness to make personal financial sacrifices seemed genuine. However, her plan included several elements that revealed how dramatically her perception of me had changed since she believed I was financially vulnerable. She suggested that I should consider selling most of my possessions to reduce both my expenses and the need for family financial support. She recommended that I downsize to a small apartment in a less expensive area, preferably one closer to either her house or Michael's so they could provide more direct assistance. Most tellingly, Emily had researched the legal process for establishing financial power of attorney, suggesting that it might be wise for me to give her or Michael the authority to make financial decisions on my behalf if my condition worsened. She presented this as a practical safeguard against my potential cognitive decline during treatment, but the timing was suspicious given her recent increased interest in my financial affairs. The conversation continued over dinner at my house, with Emily explaining each element of her plan in detail. She had clearly invested significant time and effort in developing solutions to problems she believed I was facing. Yet the underlying assumption throughout her presentation was that I was incapable of managing these challenges independently and needed her guidance and control to navigate my financial difficulties. As she spoke, I found myself observing her, with the detached analysis I typically reserved for evaluating investment opportunities. Emily was demonstrating efficiency, dedication, and problem-solving skills, but she was also revealing a fundamental lack of respect for my capabilities and autonomy. She was treating me like a financial problem to be solved, rather than a mother who deserved support and dignity during a health crisis. The next phase of my test began the following week when I called a family meeting to discuss my situation. I invited Emily, Michael, and my sister Patricia to dinner at my house, telling them I needed their advice on some important decisions about my treatment and finances. All three accepted immediately, which was notable since getting them together in one place had been nearly impossible during the early weeks of my diagnosis. I spent considerable time preparing for that dinner, both logistically and emotionally. The meal itself was simple, designed to reinforce the image of a woman trying to save money wherever possible. I served homemade soup, bread, and salad, apologizing for not providing the more elaborate meals they had enjoyed at my table in the past. I mentioned that I was trying to reduce my grocery budget to help manage my medical expenses. The conversation during dinner revealed the extent to which their perception of me had shifted. Patricia, who had been largely absent during my treatment, suddenly became very interested in my financial planning and long-term care options. She offered to help me research Medicaid eligibility and low-income housing options, suggestions that would have been insulting if they weren't so revealing of her assumptions about my situation. Michael approached the conversation with the analytical mindset of a coach developing a game plan. He had created spreadsheets calculating the family's collective ability to provide financial support, taking into account his own budget constraints and Emily's mortgage obligations. His presentation was thorough and well-intentioned, but it was based entirely on the assumption that I was incapable of managing my own financial affairs. The most significant revelation came when Emily presented her research on power of attorney arrangements. She had consulted with a lawyer friend who had explained the process for transferring financial decision-making authority to family members. Emily recommended that we establish these legal protections immediately, before my treatment potentially affected my cognitive abilities or decision-making capacity. What struck me most about this suggestion was not just the timing, but the way. Emily presented it as an obvious necessity, rather than a significant decision that deserved careful consideration. She had already identified which banks and investment firms would need to be notified, which legal documents would need to be signed, and which family member would be best positioned to assume primary financial responsibility for my affairs. The assumption underlying all of these plans was that I was fundamentally incompetent to manage my own life and finances. Despite having successfully navigated retirement planning, homeownership, and decades of independent living, my family now saw me as someone who needed their guidance and control to make basic decisions. The cancer diagnosis had apparently erased their memory of my capabilities and replaced it with a perception of helplessness that justified their intervention in every aspect of my life. As the evening progressed, I realized that my test was revealing something even more troubling than I had anticipated. It wasn't just that their care was conditional on their perception of my financial need. They actually seemed more comfortable with me being dependent and vulnerable than they had been when they thought I was strong and self-sufficient. Their increased attention and involvement wasn't just about financial obligation. It was about control and their need to feel important and needed. The dinner conversation eventually turned to specific timelines and action items. Emily wanted to schedule an appointment with her lawyer friend within the next week to begin the power of attorney process. Michael suggested that we should start looking at assisted living facilities immediately, arguing that it would be better to make housing decisions while I was still cognitively sharp rather than waiting until my condition potentially deteriorated. Patricia offered to begin sorting through my possessions to identify items that could be sold to help fund my care. She suggested starting with jewelry, artwork, and collectibles that might have value but weren't essential for daily living. Her eagerness to begin liquidating my assets was particularly striking, given her absence during the early weeks of my treatment. Throughout these discussions, I maintained the role of grateful but overwhelmed patient, thanking them for their concern and agreeing that their suggestions made sense given my supposed financial situation. But internally, I was documenting every assumption they made, every decision they attempted to make on my behalf, and every indication of how they really viewed my capabilities and worth. The evening ended with a detailed action plan that would have effectively transferred control of my life to my family within the next few weeks. Emily would handle legal and financial matters, Michael would manage housing and care decisions, and Patricia would oversee the disposition of my personal property. Each of them had claimed specific areas of authority over my life, dividing up responsibilities like executives taking over a failing business. After they left, I sat in my quiet house reviewing the events of the evening with a mixture of sadness and cold anger. The people I had raised and loved were systematically planning to strip away my autonomy and independence based on their assumption that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. They weren't consulting me about these decisions. They were informing me of choices they had already made on my behalf. The most painful realization was that they seemed to prefer me vulnerable and dependent rather than strong and self-reliant. During the early weeks of my treatment, when they thought I was handling my situation independently, they had been largely absent from my life. But now that they believed I needed their help and control, they were suddenly very available and engaged. Their attention was conditional, not just on my need for financial assistance, but on my willingness to surrender my autonomy to their management. That night, I made several decisions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my relationships with Emily, Michael, and Patricia. First, I would continue the test for exactly 4 more weeks, giving them ample opportunity to demonstrate whether their increased involvement was motivated by genuine love and concern, or by the satisfaction of having control over someone they perceived as helpless. Second, I would document everything they did and said during this period, creating a record of their behavior when they thought I was vulnerable and dependent. This documentation would serve multiple purposes. It would help me remember the truth about their character if I ever felt tempted to doubt what I was witnessing, and it would provide evidence if I ever needed to explain my future decisions to others who might question my judgment. Third, I would use this period to make some strategic changes to my estate planning and financial arrangements. If my family was revealing their true nature by attempting to take control of assets they believed were modest, I needed to protect the wealth they didn't know existed from similar attempts in the future. The following morning, I called my financial advisor and attorney to schedule appointments for the next week. I told them I needed to review and update my estate planning documents, and I wanted to explore additional asset protection strategies. Neither of them questioned the timing, since many cancer patients choose to update their financial planning during treatment. I also began implementing more sophisticated investment strategies, taking advantage of my family's belief that I was financially distressed to make moves they would never expect. I purchased additional positions in companies developing cutting-edge cancer treatments, invested in medical device manufacturers that were creating revolutionary diagnostic equipment, and bought shares in pharmaceutical giants that were likely to benefit from the aging population's increased healthcare needs. My investment activity during this period was driven not just by profit potential, but by a desire to build wealth that would demonstrate the dramatic extent of my family's miscalculation. Every successful trade, every profitable investment, every increase in my portfolio value was evidence of capabilities they had chosen to ignore and intelligence they had decided to dismiss. By my 12th treatment session, my portfolio had grown to over $14 million. The monthly dividend income alone exceeded the annual financial assistance my family was planning to provide for my supposed financial crisis. The gap between their perception of my situation and the reality of my wealth had become a chasm that would be impossible for them to comprehend when the truth was eventually revealed. Emily accompanied me to that 12th session, having appointed herself as my primary caregiver and financial manager. She brought a folder containing documents she wanted me to sign, including preliminary power of attorney forms and authorizations for her to communicate with my healthcare providers about treatment costs and insurance coverage. During the treatment, Emily spent most of her time on her phone coordinating various aspects of the plan she had developed for managing my life. She spoke with a real estate agent about evaluating my house for a potential sale, contacted senior living facilities to gather information about availability and costs, and even called a company that specialized in estate sales to discuss liquidating my personal property. The efficiency with which Emily was dismantling my independence was both impressive and terrifying. In less than 3 weeks, she had developed a comprehensive plan for transferring control of every significant aspect of my life to herself and Michael. She was treating my cancer diagnosis as an opportunity to assume authority rather than as a crisis requiring temporary support. What Emily didn't realize was that I was using my phone during that treatment session to make one of the largest investment purchases of my life. A pharmaceutical company I had been tracking for months announced that morning that they had received FDA fast-track designation for a revolutionary cancer treatment. The stock price had already begun climbing on the news, but my research suggested it would continue rising dramatically over the next several weeks. I purchased 50,000 shares while Emily sat beside me planning the sale of my house and possessions. The investment represented nearly $2 million, an amount that exceeded the total value of assets Emily believed I owned. Within hours of my purchase, the stock had gained 12%, adding over $200,000 to my portfolio, while my daughter calculated how to stretch my supposed limited resources to cover basic living expenses. The contrast between Emily's assumptions about my financial situation and the reality of my wealth had reached absurd proportions. She was agonizing over whether I could afford generic medications while I was casually making investment decisions that could fund luxury healthcare for hundreds of cancer patients. She was researching low-income housing options while I was generating passive income that exceeded most people's annual salaries. That evening, Emily called to update me on the progress she had made during the day. She had scheduled 3 appointments for me to visit assisted living facilities, arranged for a real estate agent to evaluate my house, and contacted a lawyer to finalize the power of attorney documents. She spoke with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished significant tasks on behalf of someone incapable of handling these responsibilities independently. As Emily outlined the schedule she had created for the next week, I realized that my test had revealed everything I needed to know about my family's true character. They were not just willing to assume control of my life when they thought I was vulnerable. They were eager to do so. They preferred me dependent and manageable rather than independent and strong. Their increased attention and care was not motivated by love, but by the satisfaction of having authority over someone they perceived as helpless. The time had come to begin planning the revelation that would show them exactly who they had been trying to control, and exactly how dramatically they had misjudged the woman they thought they knew. The transformation of my family's behavior had become so complete that I almost didn't recognize the people I had raised and loved for decades. Emily had appointed herself as my primary decision-maker with an efficiency that would have impressed corporate executives. Michael had assumed the role of practical coordinator, managing logistics and timelines with military precision. Patricia had positioned herself as the family historian and asset manager, cataloging my possessions and researching their potential value with an attention to detail that surprised me. What struck me most profoundly was how comfortable they had become with making decisions about my life without consulting me. The conversations that took place around my kitchen table now treated me as a subject to be discussed rather than a participant in my own life planning. They spoke about me in the third person while I sat right there, debating the merits of various assisted living facilities as if my preferences were irrelevant to the decision. Emily had become particularly assertive about establishing legal control over my finances. She called me daily with updates on her research into power of attorney arrangements, Medicare benefits, and asset protection strategies that would prepare for my anticipated cognitive decline. Her assumption that my mental faculties would deteriorate was not based on any medical evidence or doctor's recommendations, but rather on her belief that cancer patients inevitably became incapable of managing their own affairs. The irony of her assumptions was breathtaking. While Emily researched strategies for protecting my supposedly modest assets from poor decision-making, I was making investment choices that would have impressed professional fund managers. During the week she spent consulting with elder law attorneys about my presumed incompetence, I generated more profit from strategic stock trades than she earned in 6 months at her marketing job. My 14th chemotherapy session was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early November. Emily had insisted on driving me, bringing along a folder of documents she wanted to review during the treatment. She had become increasingly focused on formalizing her authority over my finances, expressing concern that delays in establishing proper legal protections could leave me vulnerable if my condition worsened unexpectedly. The treatment center had become my unofficial office for managing my investment portfolio. While other patients read books or watched television during their 4-hour sessions, I monitored market activity, researched emerging opportunities, and executed trades using my phone and tablet. The nurses had grown accustomed to seeing me engaged with financial websites and assumed I was managing my modest retirement accounts with the careful attention that fixed-income seniors typically required. That Wednesday morning brought particularly exciting news in the biotech sector. Two companies in my portfolio announced simultaneous breakthroughs in cancer immunotherapy research, and a third received unexpected FDA approval for a treatment that had been in development for years. The market response was immediate and dramatic, with all three stocks experiencing double-digit gains within hours of the announcements. I spent the first hour of my treatment session managing the windfall from these developments, rebalancing my portfolio and taking profits on positions that had exceeded my target prices. By the time Emily finished her phone calls and settled into the chair beside me, I had generated more wealth in one morning than she expected to inherit from my entire estate. Emily opened her folder and began reviewing the documents she had prepared for my signature. The power of attorney forms were more comprehensive than I had anticipated, granting her authority not just over medical decisions, but over all financial transactions, real estate holdings, and investment accounts. She had also brought documents authorizing her to communicate with my bank, brokerage firms, and insurance companies on my behalf. As she explained each document, Emily's tone carried the patient authority of someone educating a confused elderly person about necessary, but complicated procedures. She spoke slowly and clearly, frequently asking if I understood the implications of what I was signing. Her assumption that I needed this level of explanation was particularly galling, given that I was simultaneously managing investment transactions more complex than anything she had ever encountered in her marketing career. The most revealing moment came when Emily began discussing her plans for reorganizing my finances once she had legal authority. She had researched high-yield savings accounts and conservative investment options that would provide steady, predictable returns on my assets. Her strategy was designed to preserve capital rather than grow wealth, based on her assumption that my primary financial goal should be making my modest savings last as long as possible. Emily's conservative approach to investment management would have been disastrous if applied to my actual portfolio. The aggressive growth strategies that had built my wealth over decades required risk tolerance and market sophistication that she clearly lacked. Her plans would have converted my dynamic, profitable investment portfolio into a stagnant collection of bonds and certificates of deposit earning minimal returns. While Emily outlined her financial management strategy, I quietly executed a trade. I purchased additional shares in a medical device company whose stock had dropped temporarily on unfounded regulatory concerns. My analysis suggested the decline was an overreaction that would correct itself within weeks, providing an excellent opportunity to increase my position at a discount. The purchase involved nearly $300,000, an amount that exceeded Emily's annual income and would have funded the conservative investment plan she was proposing for several years. The treatment session continued with Emily making phone calls to various professionals she wanted to involve in managing my affairs. She spoke with a financial planner who specialized in senior citizens, an estate planning attorney who focused on incapacity issues, and a geriatric care coordinator who could help transition me to assisted living when my condition required it. Each conversation reinforced her narrative that I was an elderly woman whose declining health necessitated comprehensive professional management of her simple financial affairs. What Emily didn't realize was that I was listening to her conversations, while simultaneously participating in an investor conference call about emerging trends in cancer treatment development. The contrast between her assumptions about my capabilities and the reality of my activities was becoming almost comedic. She was arranging for basic financial literacy education while I was analyzing complex market dynamics that would influence healthcare investments for years to come. During the drive home from treatment, Emily explained that she had scheduled appointments for the following week that would finalize the transfer of legal and financial authority to her and Michael. She had arranged meetings with my bank, my insurance company, and the brokerage firm where she assumed I kept my modest retirement savings. Her goal was to establish herself as the primary contact for all my financial accounts and to begin implementing the conservative management strategy she had developed. Emily's plan included closing what she called my risky investment accounts and consolidating everything into safer, more predictable vehicles that would be easier for her to monitor and manage. She was particularly concerned about any individual stocks I might own, viewing them as inappropriate for someone in my situation who couldn't afford to lose money on speculative investments. If Emily had succeeded in implementing her strategy, she would have liquidated a portfolio worth over $15 million and converted it into low-yield investments that might have generated $50,000 annually. Her well-intentioned management would have destroyed more wealth in a single afternoon than most people accumulate in a lifetime. The magnitude of her mistake would have been catastrophic, though she would never have realized the true cost of her conservative approach. That evening, Emily called to confirm our appointments for the following week and to remind me to gather all my financial documents so she could review them before our meetings with various institutions. She was particularly interested in seeing my investment account statements, tax returns, and insurance policies so she could understand the full scope of my financial situation before assuming responsibility for managing it. Her request for documentation presented an interesting challenge. I obviously couldn't provide statements showing millions of dollars in investment accounts while maintaining the fiction of financial distress that had motivated her increased involvement in my life. Yet I also couldn't indefinitely delay providing the information she needed to complete the legal arrangements she was pursuing so aggressively. I decided to use this opportunity to begin the process of revealing the truth about my actual financial situation. Rather than continuing the deception indefinitely, I would strategically expose the reality of my wealth in a way that would maximize the impact and ensure my family understood exactly how dramatically they had misjudged me. The plan I developed required careful orchestration across multiple fronts. I would arrange for my family to discover my wealth through their own investigation, rather than through a simple announcement that they might dismiss or rationalize. They needed to uncover the truth themselves in a context that would make denial impossible and force them to confront the full implications of their assumptions and behavior. My first step was to contact my financial advisor and request that he prepare a comprehensive portfolio summary that would be delivered to my house the following Monday. I asked him to include detailed account statements, performance reports, and tax implications that would clearly demonstrate the scope and sophistication of my investment activities over the past 3 decades. The documents would arrive by certified mail, requiring a signature, and creating an obvious moment of discovery. I also called my attorney to schedule a meeting for Tuesday morning, ostensibly to review the power of attorney documents Emily wanted me to sign. However, I instructed him to prepare materials that would reveal the true complexity of my estate planning needs, including documentation of assets that would shock anyone who believed I was struggling to afford basic medical care. The third element of my revelation strategy involved my investment activity during the remainder of my treatment schedule. I planned to make several large, high-profile trades that would generate significant profits in a short time frame, creating undeniable evidence of my financial sophistication and success. These transactions would be timed to coincide with my family's discovery of my existing wealth, amplifying the impact of their revelation. On Friday morning, I implemented the first phase of this plan by purchasing a substantial position in a pharmaceutical company that I knew would announce positive clinical trial results the following week. The investment required nearly $2 million, funded by selling positions in companies that had reached my target prices. The timing would ensure that my family would discover this transaction just as the stock price was surging on positive news, demonstrating both my financial resources and my investment expertise. Emily called that afternoon to confirm our weekend plans, which included visiting 2 assisted living facilities she had selected based on their affordability and proximity to her house. She had scheduled tours for Saturday morning and afternoon, followed by a family dinner on Sunday where we would finalize decisions about my future living arrangements and care needs. Her enthusiasm for these plans was evident in her voice. Emily had clearly invested considerable emotional energy in developing solutions to problems she believed I couldn't handle independently. She seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of providing the guidance and structure she assumed I desperately needed. Her satisfaction at being needed and valued as a problem solver was unmistakable. The facility tours on Saturday were revealing in ways Emily hadn't anticipated. Both locations were designed for residents with limited financial resources and declining cognitive abilities. The staff spoke to me in the patronizing tone typically reserved for elderly people with dementia, and the activities programs focused on basic entertainment rather than intellectual stimulation. Emily seemed comfortable with these environments, apparently believing they were appropriate for someone in my situation. During the second facility tour, I asked detailed questions about their investment planning services and estate management resources. The activities director seemed surprised by my inquiries, explaining that most residents relied on family members to handle such matters, since financial complexity often became overwhelming for people dealing with serious health issues. Emily quickly intervened in this conversation, explaining to the staff that she would be managing my financial affairs and that I wouldn't need access to sophisticated planning resources. Her assumption that I lacked the capacity for complex financial decision-making was stated so matter-of-factly that the facility staff accepted it without question, adjusting their presentation to focus on basic care services rather than programs designed for financially independent residents. The contrast between Emily's perception of my needs and my actual capabilities was becoming impossible to ignore. She was evaluating living situations based on her belief that I was cognitively impaired and financially limited, while I was mentally calculating how the cost of premium-assisted living facilities compared to the monthly dividends from my investment portfolio. Sunday dinner at Emily's house included Michael and Patricia, who had both contributed to the planning process for my anticipated transition to managed care. The conversation centered on timelines and logistics for implementing the decisions they had made about my future. Michael had researched moving companies that specialized in senior relocations, while Patricia had contacted auction houses about selling my furniture and personal belongings. The efficiency with which they had organized the dismantling of my independent life was remarkable. Within 6 weeks of deciding that I needed their help, they had developed a comprehensive plan for transferring control of every aspect of my existence to their management. They had identified appropriate housing, arranged for professional oversight of my finances, and prepared to liquidate my possessions to fund the care they deemed necessary. Throughout dinner, they spoke about these arrangements with the satisfaction of family members who were stepping up to handle a difficult situation responsibly. Their tone conveyed pride in their thoroughness and dedication to ensuring my well-being during a challenging period. They seemed to view their assumption of control over my life as evidence of their love and commitment, rather than as a potentially inappropriate invasion of my autonomy. The most striking aspect of their discussion was how completely they had eliminated me from decision-making about my own future. They presented their plans as final determinations rather than proposals for my consideration. When I occasionally offered input or expressed preferences, they listened politely, but clearly viewed my opinions as less informed than their research and planning. Patricia had become particularly focused on the financial aspects of their plan. Having calculated precisely how much money would be available after selling my house and possessions, she had developed detailed budgets for my care costs and had researched various funding sources that could supplement my supposed limited resources. Her analysis was thorough and well-intentioned, but it was based entirely on assumptions about my financial situation that were spectacularly incorrect. As the evening progressed, I realized that my family had created a narrative about my situation that served their psychological needs as much as it addressed my practical requirements. By positioning themselves as my rescuers and protectors, they had found roles that made them feel important, needed, and morally superior. Their assumption of authority over my life wasn't just about helping me. It was about satisfying their own need to be valued and essential. The revelation I had planned for the following week would shatter this narrative completely. They would discover that the vulnerable, dependent woman they thought they were rescuing was actually one of the most financially successful people they knew. The helpless patient they had been managing was capable of making investment decisions that generated more wealth in a day than they earned in months. More importantly, they would realize that their increased attention and involvement in my life had been motivated not by my actual needs, but by their assumptions about my limitations. They had been more available and caring when they thought I was helpless than they had been when they believed I was strong and independent. Their love and support had been conditional on their perception of my vulnerability. Monday morning arrived with the gray November sky that made everything feel heavier and more serious. I woke early and prepared for what I knew would be a transformative day for my entire family. The certified mail delivery was scheduled for mid-morning, and Emily had planned to arrive shortly afterward to help me review my financial documents before our appointments later in the week. As I waited for the delivery that would begin the process of revealing my true financial situation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The cancer diagnosis that had initially seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me had actually provided an opportunity to see my family's true character. Their behavior during my supposed vulnerability had shown me exactly who they were when they thought no one was watching and judging their actions. The woman they were about to discover was not the person they thought they had been helping for the past 2 months. Barbara Lewis was not a financially struggling retiree who needed their guidance and protection. She was a sophisticated investor who had built extraordinary wealth through decades of careful research and strategic decision-making. She was someone who had been managing complex financial affairs while they were still in elementary school, and who continued to generate substantial profits while undergoing cancer treatment. The revelation would force them to confront not just their misconceptions about my capabilities, but their assumptions about what I deserved from them in terms of respect, consideration, and autonomy. They would have to acknowledge that their willingness to assume control over my life had been based not on my actual needs, but on their preference for me being dependent rather than independent. Most importantly, they would understand that their inheritance expectations, which had clearly influenced their recent behavior, were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what I had accomplished during the decades they had taken me for granted. The modest retirement savings they had been calculating and planning to manage represented a tiny fraction of wealth that could transform their own lives if they proved themselves worthy of that knowledge. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:30, announcing the arrival of the certified mail that would begin the process of changing everything. My family thought they knew about me and about themselves. The certified mail envelope felt heavier than it should have when I signed for it at my front door. The delivery driver handed me the thick package with a professional smile, unaware that he was delivering documentation that would fundamentally alter my family's understanding of reality. I held the envelope for a moment before setting it on my kitchen counter, knowing that once I opened it, there would be no returning to the fiction that had governed my relationships for the past 2 months. Emily's car pulled into my driveway, exactly 15 minutes later, arriving with the punctuality that had characterized her management of my supposed crisis. She knocked briefly before using her key to enter, calling out a cheerful greeting as she made her way to the kitchen where she expected to find me waiting with the financial documents she had requested. Instead, she found me sitting at the table with an unopened certified mail package and an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What's that, Mom?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me with the comfortable authority she had assumed over the past several weeks. "Did something important arrive?" I handed her the envelope without explanation, watching her face as she read the return address from Meridian Investment Management, the firm that had been handling my portfolio for over a decade. Emily's expression shifted from casual curiosity to focused attention as she realized this was correspondence from an investment company she had never heard me mention. "I didn't know you had accounts with this firm," she said, her tone carrying the the slight accusation of someone who had spent considerable time researching my financial situation. Is this related to Dad's old retirement funds? Rather than answering, I suggested she open the envelope and review the contents. Emily's efficient fingers worked quickly to extract the documents, and I watched her face transform as she began reading the first page of my quarterly portfolio summary. Her eyes widened as she processed the account balances, then narrowed as she tried to understand what she was seeing. The first page alone contained enough information to shatter every assumption Emily had made about my financial situation. The summary showed total assets under management exceeding $16 million, with year-to-date gains of over $2 million. The portfolio included holdings in dozens of companies across multiple sectors, with concentration in technology and healthcare stocks that had performed exceptionally well during the past several years. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she turned to the second page, which detailed my investment activity during the previous quarter. The transactions listed there included purchases and sales in amounts that dwarfed her annual income, executed with timing and precision that demonstrated sophisticated market knowledge. One trade alone had generated profits exceeding what she earned in 6 months at her marketing job. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice carrying the confusion of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing in real time. "This can't be right. These numbers are impossible." She continued reading through page after page of documentation, each one providing additional evidence of wealth and investment sophistication that contradicted everything she thought she knew about my financial situation. The quarterly performance report showed annualized returns that would have impressed professional fund managers. The tax summary indicated dividend income that exceeded the total value of assets she had believed comprised my entire estate. Silence in my kitchen stretched for several minutes as Emily processed the implications of what she was reading. Her carefully constructed plans for managing my modest finances were revealed as completely irrelevant to my actual situation. The power of attorney documents she had prepared were designed to protect assets that represented a tiny fraction of my real wealth. The assisted living facilities she had selected were appropriate for someone with limited resources, not for someone who could afford the most luxurious care available anywhere in the world. "How long have you had this much money?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely audible as she continued staring at the documents spread across the table. I explained the basic timeline, starting with my grandmother's modest inheritance and my decision to invest in educational software companies during the early days of the technology revolution. I described how I had reinvested profits, diversified into other sectors, and gradually built a portfolio that had grown far beyond anything I had initially imagined possible. I told her about the decades of research, the careful analysis of market trends, and the strategic decision-making that had generated extraordinary returns on my investments. Emily listened without interrupting, but her expression grew increasingly distant as she realized the full scope of what I had accomplished while she was growing up, believing we were a family of modest means. The woman she had been treating as financially incompetent had been making investment decisions that demonstrated expertise and sophistication she had never suspected. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand that the question was more complex than it appeared. I explained that initially, I had kept my investment activities private, because I wasn't sure they would be successful and didn't want to raise expectations that might not be fulfilled. As the years passed and my wealth grew, the secret had become easier to maintain than to reveal. Robert and I had lived comfortably on our combined salaries, and there had seemed to be no reason to complicate our family dynamics by introducing knowledge of additional resources. But the real answer to Emily's question was more uncomfortable for both of us. I had learned during the past 2 months that my family's treatment of me was fundamentally different when they believed I was vulnerable and dependent compared to when they thought I was strong and independent. Their care and attention had been conditional on their perception of my limitations, rather than motivated by genuine love and respect. As Emily absorbed this information, I could see her mind working through the implications for our recent interactions. She was beginning to realize that every decision she had made on my behalf, every plan she had developed for my future, and every assumption she had made about my capabilities had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I actually was. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation with the familiar sound that had become associated with Emily's coordinated management of my life. Without thinking, she answered using the authoritative tone she had adopted when speaking to professionals about my affairs. "Lewis residence, this is Emily speaking," she said automatically, then paused as she realized the absurdity of answering my phone as if she were my caretaker. The caller was the real estate agent Emily had contacted about evaluating my house. "For sale, calling to confirm our appointment for later that week." Emily's conversation with the agent became increasingly awkward as she tried to explain that the appointment might no longer be necessary without revealing why circumstances had changed so dramatically. She ended the call with vague promises to contact the agent if we decided to proceed with the evaluation, then sat staring at her phone as if it had betrayed her. "I need to call Michael," she said suddenly, reaching for her phone again. "He needs to see this." Michael arrived within 30 minutes, having canceled his afternoon coaching responsibilities, when Emily told him there was an emergency requiring immediate family discussion. He entered my house with the concerned urgency of someone expecting to deal with a medical crisis, but found instead his sister and mother sitting quietly at the kitchen table surrounded by financial documents. Emily handed him the portfolio summary without explanation, and I watched Michael's face go through the same transformation that Emily's had experienced an hour earlier. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a kind of stunned comprehension that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than I had seen him appear in years. "This is real?" he asked after several minutes of silent reading. "You actually have this much money?" I confirmed that the documents were accurate and current, then waited as Michael processed the implications. He was a practical person who approached problems systematically, and I could see him working through the logical consequences of this revelation for our family relationships and his own assumptions about the future. "So, you never needed our help," he said slowly, the statement emerging as both question and accusation. "You could have hired private nurses, personal drivers, premium health care. You could have afforded any kind of care you wanted." The accuracy of his observation hung in the air between us. I had indeed allowed them to believe I needed their assistance while possessing resources that would have made such help unnecessary. But the real question wasn't whether I had needed their help practically, but whether they would have provided it if they had known I didn't require it financially. Emily's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it automatically, before looking up with an expression of growing mortification. "It's Patricia," she said quietly. "She's asking about the auction house appointment she scheduled for next week to evaluate your furniture." The mention of Patricia triggered a memory that made the current situation even more surreal. My sister had spent hours researching the potential value of my possessions, calculating how much money could be raised by selling items I had accumulated over decades of marriage and family life. She had approached the task with dedication and thoroughness, motivated by her belief that liquidating my belongings was necessary to fund my care. Michael was still studying the investment documents, shaking his head occasionally as he encountered particularly impressive performance numbers. "You made more money last month than I make in a year," he said finally, "and we were planning to give you monthly allowances to help with your expenses." The irony in his voice was unmistakable, but beneath it was something that sounded like embarrassment or shame. He was beginning to understand that their recent behavior had been based not on accurate assessment of my needs, but on assumptions that revealed more about their prejudices than about my reality. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed my attorney's office confirming our appointment for the following morning. Emily and Michael both looked at me expectantly, apparently assuming that this call was related to the power of attorney arrangements Emily had been pursuing so aggressively. "That's my estate planning attorney," I explained after ending the call. "I scheduled an appointment to discuss some changes to my will and trust arrangements." Emily's face went pale as she realized the implications. "You already have estate planning documents? Complex ones?" I explained that I had been working with estate planning professionals for over 15 years, updating my documents regularly as my financial situation evolved and tax laws changed. My current will and trust arrangements were sophisticated instruments designed to manage substantial assets and minimize tax implications for my beneficiaries. The simple power of attorney forms Emily had prepared were completely inadequate for managing an estate of my size and complexity. The kitchen fell silent again as Emily and Michael absorbed this additional layer of revelation. Not only had they misunderstood my financial situation, they had also dramatically underestimated the complexity of managing my actual assets. The legal arrangements they had been pursuing would have been laughably insufficient for handling my real estate planning needs. "We need to call Patricia," Emily said suddenly. "She needs to know about this before she makes any more appointments or arrangements." Michael nodded in agreement, and I watched as they struggled with how to explain to my sister that everything they had planned and researched over the past 2 months was based on completely false assumptions. Patricia had been as invested in their rescue narrative as Emily and Michael, and she would have to confront her own misconceptions about my capabilities and circumstances. Emily called Patricia using the speaker function, beginning the conversation with the awkward announcement that significant new information had emerged about my financial situation. Patricia's initial response was confused concern that I had hidden debts or legal problems that would complicate their care planning. When Emily began reading some of the numbers from my portfolio summary, Patricia's confusion turned to stunned silence. "That can't be right," Patricia finally said, her voice carrying the disbelief of someone whose entire understanding of reality was being challenged. "Barb doesn't know anything about investing. She's never even mentioned owning stocks." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Emily and Michael taking turns reading portions of my financial documents to Patricia over the phone. Each new piece of information seemed to deepen her shock and confusion. She had difficulty accepting that her sister, whom she had seen as financially naive and practically helpless, had actually been building extraordinary wealth for decades while maintaining a facade of middle-class modesty. "I've already scheduled the estate sale consultation," Patricia said weakly near the end of the call. "I've been researching antique dealers and auction houses for weeks." The absurdity of the situation was becoming overwhelming. My family had spent enormous amounts of time and energy developing solutions to problems that didn't exist, based on assumptions that were completely wrong. They had been racing to rescue someone who was more financially secure than they could have imagined, while treating that person as if she lacked the intelligence and capability to manage her own affairs. As the phone call with Patricia ended, Emily and Michael sat quietly at my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of wealth and financial sophistication that contradicted everything they thought they knew about me. The silence was heavy with implications that none of us were quite ready to address directly. "Why did you let us make all those plans?" Emily asked finally, her voice carrying hurt and confusion. "Why did you let us think you needed our help?" The question was fair, but the answer was complicated. I explained that I had wanted to see how they would respond when they thought I was vulnerable and dependent. Their behavior during my cancer treatment had revealed aspects of their character that I needed to understand before making decisions about our future relationship and their potential inheritance. "You were testing us," Michael said, his tone flat with realization. "You wanted to see if we would actually take care of you or if we would abandon you." I confirmed that their behavior had indeed been a test, though not one I had planned initially. Their absence during my early treatment sessions had prompted me to create the fiction of financial distress to see whether their care was conditional on their perception of my needs. The results had been both illuminating and disappointing. Emily's face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and embarrassment. So when were we supposed to learn the truth? After we had moved you into assisted living and sold your house? The question highlighted the ethical complexity of what I had done. I had allowed them to invest significant time and emotional energy in developing plans that were unnecessary and inappropriate for my actual situation. But I had also learned essential truths about their motivations and character that would influence our relationships for whatever time I had remaining. I learned that your care and attention increased dramatically when you thought I needed your financial help, I said quietly. When you believed I was managing my situation independently, you were largely absent from my treatment. When you thought I was struggling, you became very involved and concerned. The truth of this observation was undeniable, and both Emily and Michael struggled to find responses that didn't confirm what I was saying. They had been more available, more attentive, and more caring when they believed I was vulnerable than when they thought I was strong. Michael was the first to acknowledge the pattern directly. We thought you were handling everything fine on your own, he said defensively. We didn't want to interfere if you didn't need help. But Emily was beginning to understand the deeper implications of what had happened. You're saying we only cared about you when we thought you needed us to take care of you, she said slowly. When we thought you were independent, we assumed you didn't want our involvement. The conversation was approaching territory that would be difficult for all of us to navigate. We were talking about love, family loyalty, and the conditions under which care and attention are provided. These were not abstract philosophical questions, but practical issues that had real consequences for how we would relate to each other going forward. I'm saying that your behavior was different when you thought I was helpless compared to when you thought I was capable, I replied carefully. And I needed to understand whether your concern was motivated by genuine love or by your sense of obligation to someone you perceived as unable to manage independently. The weight of this distinction settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. We all understood that we were discussing something fundamental about family relationships and the nature of care provided across generations. The conversation was no longer about money or medical treatment, but about respect, autonomy, and the assumptions we make about people based on our perceptions of their vulnerabilities. Emily stood up suddenly and began pacing around the kitchen, her movements agitated and uncertain. I don't know how to process this, she said, gesturing toward the financial document still spread across the table. Everything we thought we knew about you, about our family, about the future. It's all wrong. Michael remained seated but was clearly struggling with similar feelings. I keep thinking about all the conversations we had about your finances, all the plans we made, he said. We were treating you like you couldn't understand your own situation. The recognition was painful for all of us. They were confronting. The reality that they had been condescending and controlling toward someone who was actually more financially sophisticated than they were. They had assumed authority over decisions that belonged to someone far more qualified to make them. They had positioned themselves as protectors of someone who needed no protection. What happens now? Emily asked, stopping her pacing to face me directly. How do we move forward from this? The question was exactly what I had been preparing to address. The revelation of my wealth was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in our relationships. How we proceeded would depend on their willingness to acknowledge what they had learned about themselves and their commitment to treating me with the respect and autonomy I deserved, regardless of their perceptions of my vulnerabilities. I explained that my cancer treatment would continue for several more weeks and that I would need emotional support during that process. But I would no longer accept being treated as incompetent or incapable of making decisions about my own life. If they wanted to be involved in my care, it would be as partners in my healing rather than as managers of my supposed incompetence. I also explained that my estate planning would need to be revised based on what I had learned about their character and motivations. The way they had behaved when they thought I was vulnerable would influence decisions about inheritance and legacy that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Emily and Michael exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the long-term implications of their behavior during my supposed crisis. They had been auditioning for roles in my future without realizing they were being evaluated. Their performance during that audition would determine not just our ongoing relationship, but also their financial futures. "We made mistakes," Emily said quietly. "We made assumptions and we treated you badly. I can see that now." Michael nodded in agreement. "We should have trusted you to know what you needed and asked how we could help instead of deciding what was best for you." Their acknowledgement was a beginning, but rebuilding trust and respect would require sustained effort and genuine change in how they approached our relationship. They would need to demonstrate that they could value me as a person rather than as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. The afternoon sun was setting as we concluded our conversation, casting long shadows across the kitchen where so many family decisions had been made over the years. The documents scattered across the table represented not just financial wealth, but also the revelation of capabilities and achievements that my family had never recognized or appreciated. As Emily and Michael prepared to leave, they both seemed smaller and more uncertain than they had appeared in weeks. The confidence they had displayed while managing my supposed crisis had evaporated, replaced by the humbling recognition that they had fundamentally misjudged the person they thought they were helping. "Will you tell us about your investments sometime?" Michael asked as he gathered his jacket. "I'd like to understand how you learned to do this." The question suggested a willingness to see me as someone with knowledge and expertise, rather than as someone who needed their guidance and protection. It was a small step toward the kind of respectful relationship I hoped we might eventually rebuild. Emily hugged me goodbye with an awkwardness that reflected her uncertainty about how to relate to the person I had revealed myself to be. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "For all of it." Her apology was a beginning, but it would take time and consistent behavior to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. Trust, once broken, requires patient rebuilding through actions rather than words. After they left, I sat, alone in my quiet house, surrounded by the financial documents that had changed everything. The numbers on those pages represented more than money. They represented decades of quiet determination, careful research, and strategic thinking that my family had never suspected I possessed. The cancer treatment would continue, but I would face it with the dignity and autonomy I deserved rather than the false helplessness my family had tried to impose on me. I had learned who they really were when they thought I was vulnerable, and they had learned who I really was when I chose to reveal my strength. The future remained uncertain, but it would be shaped by truth rather than assumptions, by respect rather than condescension, and by relationships based on reality rather than fiction. I had been building more than financial wealth during those quiet decades. I had been building the foundation for a life of independence and dignity that no one could take away from me. The revelation was complete, but the real work of rebuilding our family relationships based on truth and mutual respect was just beginning. Whether Emily, Michael, and Patricia would prove themselves worthy of the legacy I had built remained to be seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.